Hey y'all! It is a beautiful, crisp January morning. It also happens to be Confederate Heroes Day, so we're going to go check out some Texas frontier forts. It's a great day. Let's go exploring. Many of the earliest fortifications in Texas were private forts where settlers could gather in times of alarm. One of the earliest and elaborate of these private forts was Fort Parker. Daniel Parker and other members of their church came to Texas from Crawford County, Illinois in 1833. Daniel and the majority of his followers settled in present-day Elkhart, where a replica of their Pilgrim Baptist Church still stands. The elder John Parker and three of his sons, Silas, James, and Benjamin, began in December 1833 to clear land to construct Parker's Fort near the Navasota River, between what is now the cities of Groesbeck and Maya. In March of 1834, the fort was complete, and the families of the brothers, along with the other members of the group, moved to the fort and began clearing land for fields. Our tour guide and a volunteer at the historic site sat with us to describe what is now an infamous event that occurred on May 19th, 1836.
You know the story of how the fort came to be here, all right? It was occupied from 1833 to 1836, the spring of 1836. Now, 1836 was a very tumultuous time in Texas. We were in the middle of the Texas Revolution. We were breaking away from Mexico. The Alamo had just happened in the spring of that year, so tensions were high. And our founding fathers were meeting in basically a constitutional convention down at Washington on the Brazos, about 100 miles south of here. And they had been there for a couple of months already. They were all learned men. They were lawyers and doctors, and so they were long-winded and couldn't agree on anything. And it dragged out. This takes us into the latter part of April of 1836. And something happened that nobody had anticipated, which was the Indians showed up for the party. A group of Comanche primarily, but I'm told there were also some Kiowa involved, showed up at Washington on the Brazos, and basically they said, hey, we're Texans too. We want to be a part of this. We want to have a voice. Well, it was not our brightest hour. They were pretty much laughed out of the hall. They were told that the future of Texas really did not include a place for the Indians, and that they should just take their stuff and leave. Surprisingly enough, they did. There are some accountings that say they didn't do it with the most grace possible, but they did pull out and they left. 10 days later, which is to say about a comfortable 10-mile-a-day ride from Washington on the Brazos to here, in the morning they showed up here at Fort Parker. Now, we do not know, there is no way to prove that it is the same Indians that were at Washington on the Brazos that showed up here. But the timing works out. A group of them, probably between 10 and 20, came to the front gate. They said they wanted to trade for beef and water their horses. Now, the settlers were a little dubious because their horses were dripping wet from crossing the Navasota. But they opened the gate and Benjamin Parker went out. Now, there were only 5 men in the fort that morning, Benjamin and 4 others. The rest of the men were working in the fields up to 2 miles away. When Benjamin got within range, they hit him in the head with a tomahawk and killed him. Some accountings say they shot him with an arrow, others say they hit him with a tomahawk. Ultimately, it doesn't matter, he was dead. That's when the estimated other 400 to 500 Comanche and Kiowa came out of the trees and stormed the fort. They got in through the front gate. The other 4 men in the fort had muzzle-loading rifles, probably percussion rifles. Actually, I'm not sure they had percussion. They may have had flintlocks at that point. But they probably got off one shot. And then they were overwhelmed. They were killed as well. The Indians then took their time, rounded up the women and the children, chose who they wanted, and they took away 5 people. There was Miss Plummer, who had a child already and was pregnant. She was 17. And then there was Miss, I think, Kellogg, and I'm not certain about that one. And then Cynthia Ann and her younger brother John. They took them away. Now, Miss Kellogg was ransomed back in about a month. Miss Plummer was eventually ransomed back about a year and a half later. Cynthia Ann and her brother John were never offered to ransom. They stayed with the Comanche. They were raised as Comanche. Now, John stayed with the Comanche until he was in his early 20s. He was 7 when he was taken, I believe. And at that time, he caught some disease. I've read that it was smallpox, but it's hard to be certain. And the Comanche, as was their custom, abandoned him behind the trail to die, or beside the trail to die. And strangely enough, he didn't. He was found by a young Mexican girl who nursed him back to health. They later married, from what I understand, and he spent the rest of his life working in cattle ranches in the New Mexico territories. Cynthia Ann stayed with the Comanche about 25 years. Now, she was 9 when she was taken. When she was old enough, probably around 15, 16, in those days was normal, she married a Comanche warrior named Peta Nakona. And Peta was a pretty big deal in his own right, but he was also the son of Iron Shirt, who was one of the grand war chiefs of the Comanche. Now, when Peta passed, when Iron Shirt passed, Peta Nakona became a war chief of the Comanche as well. And he and Cynthia Ann had 3 children, the eldest of which was Quanah Parker. And of course, if you grew up here in Texas, you've probably heard of Quanah Parker. Quanah was an incredible individual, apparently. The Comanche tend to view him as kind of a cross between Thomas Jefferson and George Washington or Benjamin Franklin. He was their elder statesman. And he did something that nobody really would have expected, because prior to Quanah, the Comanche were High Plains raiders. They swooped in, they took what they wanted, they killed everybody they saw just about, and that's how they lived. They were very aggressive, very fierce. In Quanah's lifetime as war chief, he took them from that to being landowners, ranchers, businessmen, even congressmen. Quanah did a stint in the Oklahoma legislature himself. He rubbed elbows with the powerful among the whites at that time. He led the Comanche from one way of life into another. He even had his own railroad. Just a couple of years ago, some pictures were uncovered in somebody's attic of Quanah Parker and Teddy Roosevelt sitting elbow to elbow with each other at a campfire during a wolf hunt on a big ranch in West Texas. He completely, almost reinvented the Comanche into something that could survive in the modern world. Had it not been for Quanah, the Comanche would probably have died out because their way of life just couldn't be sustained. Now, Cynthia Ann was with the Comanche for about 25 years. At the end of that time, she was staying in a Comanche encampment village up on the Peace River in the Panhandle region of Texas. And it was raided by the Texas Rangers. Now, in those days, the Texas Rangers were a quasi-military force, specifically formed up to suppress the danger of the Indians. Later on, of course, they became lawmen with shiny badges and 10-gallon hats, and everybody thinks they're the greatest thing that ever happened. In the early days, they were a little bit different. Well, they killed a number of the Indians that day, and they were likely to have killed Cynthia Ann and her infant daughter, Prairie Flower, who was under a year old. As well, Cynthia Ann managed to get to a horse. She was trying to get away. They chased her down, got her on the ground, and some accounts said they were getting ready to kill her too, until the captain of the Rangers noticed that she had bright blue eyes. And this was just unheard of among the Indians at the time. So they knew something was going on. Well, they tried to talk to her, but she refused to talk to them in English. She was very, very angry. They informed her that her husband and her sons had been killed. That was a lie, by the way. They were fine, although she never saw them again. They took her back with them, and eventually they found a Tonkawa interpreter to speak to them, or speak to her. And they established that she was, in fact, the Cynthia Ann Parker that had been kidnapped from this fort here 25 years before. And they brought her back and they set her up with the Parker family. She was miserable. She wanted desperately to go back to the Comanche. They wouldn't let her go. She begged them, just leave a horse where I can get to it. I'll be gone. You never have to worry about it. Not happening. They always brought her back. She ended up doing a lot of different jobs for the Parker family, but the one that is most commonly reported is as a cook at a lumber mill, a sawmill, cooking for the men that worked there. She was back in the white world about 4 years. At the end of that time, disease went through central Texas. They're thinking it was probably some variant of Spanish flu, but once again, it's hard to say for sure. Just about everybody caught it. Yeah, River wants to add her 2 cents. Just about everybody caught it. Cynthia Ann did recover, but Prairie Flower did not. She died. And at that point, Cynthia Ann just pretty much gave up hope. She'd been told her husband and sons had been killed, her daughter had just been buried, and she quit eating. She didn't last maybe a month after that.
Starved herself to death.
But this is really where it all started. The skirmish that happened here that morning in May of 1836 was really the first engagement of the Indian Wars here in Texas. And the Indians pretty much won the day. It's not a fairy tale kind of story.
No.
There's a lot of pain and a lot of injustice that happened during it. But it's true. You know, this really happened and this is where it happened.
The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War in 1848 and placed an obligation upon the U.S. government to protect Mexico from raids by the Indian tribes of the North. President Polk put Brigadier General Zachary Taylor in charge of establishing protection of the settlers located in the new territory along and ahead of the original frontier line. The southernmost fort along the original line was Fort Martin Scott. The current historical site of the reconstructed fort is located just outside Fredericksburg. Another privately owned frontier fort, Fort Leaton, is located on the Big Bend State Park grounds in Presidio, Texas, and supported by the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Originally on the site of a Spanish residence built in 1773, Ben Leaton purchased the property and made it his residence and trading post in 1848. The U.S. Army used it as an unofficial headquarters until Fort Davis was completed in 1854.